All right, underground injection control. How many of you have an underground injection well on your campus? Anybody? Well, you may be surprised when you find out some things that are considered underground injection wells. It sounds like something pretty fantastic, pretty out there, a high-tech operation you wouldn't conduct, but you actually may. So, underground injection control, again, it's a pretty straightforward program. There are a lot of pieces to this, but the ones that potentially apply to a campus are fairly limited. It was part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The idea is to protect underground sources of drinking water from being contaminated. And the federal UIC regulations are at 40 CFR Part 144. These are the primary regulations we'll be looking at today. And EPA has delegated authority for the UIC program to Georgia. This is the setup of the federal program. And here we've got Georgia. And Georgia's rules are really quite a bit more extensive than the federal underground injection control rules. They've added a whole lot of additional requirements to it. Basically, the underground injection control rules outline these criteria. They define what the 5 classes of underground injection control wells are, describe permitting application procedures, permit terms and conditions, identify criteria and standards applicable to wells, standards for the well mechanical integrity, procedures to plug and abandon a well, or they identify prohibited wells, the kinds of wells that might fit into this category that you're not allowed to have anymore. So what is underground injection? Start there. A well injection means a subsurface placement of fluids through a well. A well is a bored, drilled, or driven shaft whose depth is greater than the largest surface dimension. So it's deeper than the opening is wide at the top. An open dug hole whose depth is greater than the largest surface dimension. An improved sinkhole or a subsurface fluid distribution system. Ditches and drains are not wells. As we get to this, you'll see that there are some common types of wells. There are 5 classes of injection wells. You're unlikely to find class 1 through 4 on any campus. I haven't seen it yet, not to say it's not out there, but it's unlikely. You are likely to find class 5 injection wells, at least on some. So I'll go through the definitions of 1 through 4 relatively quickly. A class 1 well is industrial or municipal wells that are located near a source of drinking water. Class 2 are wells related to oil and natural gas production. Class 3 are wells related to certain mining operations. Again, I'm not going to go through the definitions in detail. They're there if you want to review them for your interest, but these things just really won't apply to campuses. Class 4 wells, hopefully you don't have these because they're banned in Georgia, but they're underground injection wells, septic systems, or cesspools to inject hazardous or radioactive waste. Is anybody injecting hazardous or radioactive waste below ground? Good. Now class 5 wells. This is where we might have something. Class 5 wells include all shallow injection wells used to place fluids directly below the surface that are not class 1, 2, 3, or 4. So what does that mean? What are some examples? And this will help put it in perspective for you. Some examples of types of class 5 injection wells are air conditioning and cooling tower return flow wells, large capacity cesspools that serve greater than 20 people a day, although if you have one of these, it should have been closed a few years ago. Stormwater dry wells, those are pretty commonly found. Dry wells to inject waste into subsurface formations, recharge wells to replenish aquifers, remediation wells, saltwater intrusion barrier wells, backfill wells associated with subsurface mines, and septic systems that serve more than 20 persons a day. So again, the ones you're most likely to encounter on a campus are going to be the dry wells for your stormwater system and large septic systems. So what is a dry well? This is a really nice schematic I like. This is actually sort of a fancy dry well setup. It doesn't need to be this elaborate. But a dry well is basically just a hole in the ground into which your storm water goes and then percolates out into the soil from there. A dry well does not have an outlet, meaning that once the water goes in there, its whole intent is to just percolate into the ground. Now, if you have a stormwater collection system composed of conveyances and catch basins that all ultimately have an outflow that go to some sort of water, that's not a dry well because you've got things connecting, you've got the water moving away. Here you happen to have two wells that are connected, but you can see the water comes into this well, goes from this PVC pipe into the secondary well, and then it just goes down into the ground from there. There's no outlet to either of these so that the water is being dispersed. So this is basically what a stormwater dry well is. It's a hole in the ground into which stormwater runs, and it's not anything elaborate. It's not receiving anything else other than stormwater, but it's considered a Class 5 injection well. Prohibited wells. These are the different kinds of wells that you are not allowed to have. We already mentioned the Class 4 wells for radioactive and hazardous waste. New drainage wells that have not been permitted and designed by a professional geologist or professional engineer. New large capacity cesspools, those had to be closed by 2005. Open loop heat pump systems discharge and return water to a well, and motor vehicle waste disposal wells. And we'll take a look now at what a motor vehicle waste disposal well is, because I do see these occasionally. It's basically, you've got a facility that conducts vehicle maintenance and repair operations. It has a floor drain in the garage area, and the floor drain discharges to a dry well or discharges to a septic system that just disperses it right there on site. There's no outflow. So it's not connected to sanitary sewer. It's just going into the ground. This is prohibited. You're not allowed to have these anymore. So if you had a scenario like this, you have to close those wells and either connect into the sanitary sewer or just do without that floor drain. It varied from state to state. So I'm not sure exactly when it was, but within the past couple of years. Not something that was 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah, if you have one of these, you're not allowed to have it anymore. You can't have floor drains from a vehicle maintenance area going into either a well or a septic system. Oh, you'd be surprised. That's what facilities do. I ran into one just last fall.
Really?
Yep.
In America?
In America. Absolutely. So if you have a well, what does that mean? I had a question earlier. What do you have to do with it? Go through this quickly because, again, I don't think we're going to run across these wells, but Class 1, 2, or 3 wells have to be permitted. They have to be constructed and, or operated prior to obtaining a permit from EPD. They may not be constructed or operated, prior to obtaining that permit from EPD. The applications have to include a chemical analysis of injected fluids, diagrams, maps, subsurface reports, corrective action plans. It's quite a process to permit them. And EPA will make public notice on the draft permit. So again, this is for Class 1, 2, or 3 wells, not the Class 5 wells. When you're operating a Class 1, 2, or 3 well, you have to operate in accordance with federal and state operating, monitoring, and reporting requirements. And you have to inform the EPD in writing of your intent to abandon the well 45 days in advance and then comply with all of the closure requirements. Now if you have a Class 5 well, which I'm willing to bet we're going to come across some in the system, it has to be permitted prior to construction and operation. Again, even if we're talking about that dry well for your stormwater system. If you're operating an existing well at the time of the regulations became effective, you were supposed to have done this by July 1st, 2001. The operating permit application, depending upon which type of Class 5 injection well you have, the size, there's different permitting requirements. So it's kind of a little funny with the state right now. But what it could include, again, is a chemical analysis of the injected fluid. And again, for your storm water, this is a little bit different than if you're injecting some of the other fluids that could be covered under other Class 5 wells. So it would be a little more straightforward for something like that. But it may include these things depending upon what you're injecting. A diagram showing the engineering layout of the system, subsurface report prepared by professional geologists, a statement from the local government indicating there's no conflict with local zoning or planning laws, a well orientation map, and a corrective action plan. Now, septic systems handled a little bit differently. The permitting. As we mentioned, septic systems serving greater than 20 people a day are Class 5 injection wells. Based upon guidance, I talked to EPD because the regulations aren't a little clear. You know, what is serving, potential to serve greater than 20 persons a day? Because a lot of people say, well, what size tank is that? And different people I talked to said either 2,000 or 2,500 gallon is what they would use as an estimate for the size of the system that meets this requirement. So if you have a 2,000 gallon or more septic system, it's going to be considered a Class 5 injection well. If the septic system receives a mixture of sanitary and process or industrial wastewaters, it is permitted through the EPD Watershed Protection Branch, and you would use an application for mixed non-domestic septic systems. So it's not receiving just septic sanitary waste, it's also got some sort of process waste going into it. If the septic receives only sanitary waste and has a capacity of greater than 10,000 gallons, it's permitted as a large community system through a general permit issued by EPD's Engineering and Technical Support Division. The permit is required under the UIC rules, and you see here the citation 391-3-6-13, so on and so forth. But it's issued under the Land Application System rules, using a large community subsurface system engineering submittal application. And I guess we're providing a lot of this information to you because I had to spend time researching it and calling everybody around to figure out how to permit all of this. So if you have one, we've saved you a little bit of legwork in getting this going. The smaller systems, EPD hasn't yet developed a general permit for the 2,000 to 10,000 gallon sanitary only septic systems. These should be permitted by your county health departments. However, the folks at EPD said sometimes the county health departments won't do it, and if they won't, then EPD will permit these smaller systems for you. So the construction and operation, there are also specific requirements in the rules. You not only have to permit it, but it has to meet certain specific construction design criteria, and then you might have operating monitoring requirements that go along with that. So first of all, it has to be constructed by a licensed water well contractor, have a casing that extends at least 5 feet into the injection zone, grouted and sealed annular space around the entire length of the casing, and you have to comply with other requirements as specified by the director, whatever they may be. Class 5 wells, again, may have permit conditions that require monitoring, testing, and reporting. That will be dependent upon once you apply, they'll take a look, see what you're injecting, what the conditions are, and then decide from that point. You may have to meet mechanical integrity requirements for the well design. Just some general criteria that are listed under the UIC rules, again, because the whole point of these regulations is to prevent contamination from any of these subsurface injections from getting to drinking water. Any activity that allows the movement of fluid to contaminate underground sources of drinking water violates Georgia's primary drinking water standard. So any of those actions that could adversely affect human health are prohibited. It's just sort of a general blanket statement made in the regulations, which you could apply many different ways, I imagine. And then except for remediation wells, injection of fluids is prohibited in the inner management zone of a wellhead protection area. So while the rules are a little bit complex and there are a lot of technical requirements as far as the construction standards of the well, I think that as they relate to the campus and as they are auditable, they're relatively straightforward. Because when you do an audit, again, you're not going to necessarily ask to see the design schematics for that septic system or for that dry well, because we're going to assume that if it got the permit from EPD or the agency, that they reviewed those because they would have had to, and so that it met the requirements. So it's one of those things, again, you don't have to go to that step. It's more of a paperwork review. It's more of, do they have the permit? If they meet one of these criteria, has it been permitted with the agency? And if so, what are the specific permit conditions? And so at that point, you'll have to get a copy of the permit and see what are they required to do. Is there some sort of monitoring or reporting that has to be done based upon that well's operation? And again, when you're doing this program, don't say, do you have any underground injection wells? Because the answer will be no. You have to ask about the specific kinds of wells. Just like when I first asked in the beginning, nobody thought they would have those. But if you ask about those certain kinds of Class 5 wells that are listed out, again, primary among them, the large septic systems and the dry wells, then you might get a different answer. So make sure you ask that question that way. And another thing to ask about with relation to this, and this is a program that often goes along with the other water programs, such as stormwater, wastewater, that we're going to talk about tomorrow, and you'll see why when we talk about those, these might be related, is sort of the question about floor drains. and where are their floor drains going. Because again, if it's from a vehicle shop and it's going to a waste, a dry well or a septic system, it's not allowed. And if it is in some other process area and you've got a floor drain going to some sort of a dry well system, may or may not be allowed, but it would need to be permitted. So the whole floor drain issue is important for this program and for the other water programs that we'll talk about tomorrow.